The American South, mid-19th century. The land was green, fertile, and cruel. Rice fields stretched endlessly beneath a sky that offered no mercy, their shallow waters reflecting the sun like sheets of broken glass. The air was thick with humidity, mosquitoes, and silence, the kind of silence that settled over places where suffering had become ordinary. This was a world built on routine. Bells rang, commands were given, bodies moved, and pain was absorbed without ceremony. And within this world lived Eliza Brooks. No one noticed her. To the white owners of Hartcroft Plantation, Eliza was not a person but a function. She washed clothes. She carried water. She swept floors already destined to be dirty again. She moved through rooms without leaving a trace, spoke only when spoken to, and kept her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Overseers rarely called her name, because they rarely needed to. She required no supervision. She never argued. She never resisted. She's a good one, they said. Quiet. Broken. Safe. They were wrong. Eliza had learned early that survival did not belong to the loud. It belonged to those who could disappear without vanishing, to those who could exist without being seen. Her body performed obedience, but her mind remained awake, sharp, and hungry. While others spoke, she listened. While others reacted, she remembered. She memorized footsteps, which ones hurried, which ones dragged, which ones came drunk at night. She memorized voices, who whispered, who lied, who feared losing money more than losing sleep. She memorized patterns, when the master was generous, when he was cruel, and when his cruelty was fueled by panic rather than power. Eliza did not yet know why she remembered these things. She only knew that remembering felt like resistance. Her childhood had taught her that lesson long before she had words for it. She had been born on this land, the daughter of a woman who had once belonged to another plantation, another county, another name. Her mother had taught her few things. There was never time, but one lesson had been repeated until it carved itself into Eliza's bones. Keep your thoughts quiet. They can't whip what they can't hear. For years, Eliza believed that endurance was enough. That if she bent low enough, the storms would pass over her. That pain, like everything else, could be survived by patience. Then they took her son. His name was Eli. He was 7 years old. Too curious. Too quick to ask questions. He had her eyes, observant, searching, and that frightened her more than any whip ever had. She tried to teach him silence. Tried to teach him how to shrink. But children are born believing the world will answer them kindly. One morning, without warning, a wagon arrived. There were papers. Handshakes. Numbers spoken aloud as if they meant nothing. Eli was pulled from her arms before she understood what was happening. No explanation was offered. None was required. Children were assets. Children were currency. Eliza did not scream. She did not beg. She stood perfectly still as the wagon disappeared down the road, carrying her child toward a destination she would never be told. The overseer mistook her silence for acceptance. That night, something inside Eliza ended. And something else began. She stopped hoping. She stopped praying for mercy. She stopped believing endurance alone could save anyone. From that moment on, Eliza no longer lived inside the days, she studied them. She noticed how careless the masters were when they believed themselves untouchable. How openly they spoke in front of people they considered invisible. How much of their power relied not on strength, but on the certainty that no one beneath them could think, plan, or remember. That certainty was their weakness. Eliza understood, slowly and with terrible clarity, that slavery was not sustained by chains alone. It was sustained by arrogance. By the belief that domination made one invulnerable. By the blindness of men who never imagined that the quiet woman sweeping their floors might be learning the structure of their world. She became smaller on purpose. Quieter. More obedient than ever. And in that shrinking, she disappeared completely from their sight. But inside her, a different Eliza was growing, patient, watchful, and dangerous in ways they could not yet imagine. The system had taken her child. In return, it had created something it did not know how to control. Eliza Brooks had become unseen. And the unseen, she would soon learn, could move freely through the heart of power itself. The house was never quiet. It only pretended to be. By day, Hartcroft Plantation's main house was filled with movement, doors opening and closing, boots striking hardwood floors, silverware clinking against porcelain. By night, it breathed differently. Voices lowered. Candles burned. Men spoke as though the walls themselves were loyal. They forgot the walls were alive. Eliza worked inside the house now. It was considered a promotion. Less sun. Less mud. Cleaner hands. The mistress liked her because she did not hover, did not stare, did not ask questions. Eliza moved like a shadow through the rooms, collecting dust, collecting linens, collecting fragments of a world never meant for her ears. And so she listened. She listened as the master argued with his brother about money. She listened as visiting planters complained about falling crop prices and rising interest. She listened as names were spoken in frustration, followed by numbers that meant nothing to them, but everything to her. Eliza had learned numbers the way other children learned prayers. She counted steps while scrubbing floors. Counted heartbeats while standing still. Counted sacks of rice loaded onto wagons and compared them to the arguments she overheard later that night. They were lying. And they did not know she could tell. She learned that Hartcroft Plantation was drowning in debt. That loans had been taken against future harvests that did not yet exist. That the master's confidence was built on fragile paper agreements and men he feared more than he admitted. She learned which overseers drank too much. Which ones skimmed profits. Which ones beat harder when they felt weak. Every secret formed a thread. And Eliza began to weave. She never wrote anything down. Writing left evidence. Instead, she turned her mind into a ledger, precise, ordered, unforgetting. Dates aligned. Patterns emerged. The same names surfaced again and again, always followed by tension, always spoken behind closed doors. The white men spoke freely because they believed she could not understand. That belief made them careless. They discussed selling people as casually as selling horses. They debated which children would fetch the highest price, which families could be split with the least disruption to labor. Their conversations were practical, detached, and terrifying in their normality. Eliza felt each word like a stone dropped into her chest. But she did not react. She absorbed. Over time, the knowledge grew heavy, too heavy for one person to carry alone. So Eliza began to pass it on. Not directly. Not dangerously. Information moved through gestures, pauses, and carefully chosen silences. A word dropped while folding laundry. A warning delivered as a question. A look held just long enough to mean something more. "She's nervous tonight," Eliza might say quietly to another woman. "He drinks when he's afraid," she might whisper to a man she trusted. Nothing that could be traced. Nothing that could be punished. Yet the effect was unmistakable. People began to prepare without knowing exactly why. Mothers kept children closer. Men avoided certain roads on certain days. Small choices were made, subtle, quiet adjustments that shifted survival from chance to strategy. Eliza had not yet told anyone to run. But she had taught them how to see. Among the enslaved, her reputation changed. Not loudly. Not openly. It always began the same way, with someone saying, "She knows things." No one asked how. They did not need to. She became a point of gravity, pulling scattered observations into meaning. A woman who could explain why a beating happened on a Tuesday, why wagons came early, why silence suddenly mattered more than noise. To the masters, she remained harmless. To the enslaved, she became something new. A keeper of truth. And slowly, without lifting a hand or raising her voice, Eliza Brooks began to change the balance of power. The plantation still looked the same. The work continued. The commands were obeyed. But beneath the surface, knowledge was moving, invisible, unstoppable. And for the first time, the system that believed itself all-knowing was being studied from the inside. Not with anger. Not with haste. But with patience. Knowledge, Eliza understood now, was the most dangerous thing a slave could possess. And she was learning to use it. The wagon arrived before dawn. Its wheels cut deep grooves into the dirt road, slow and deliberate, as if the earth itself resisted its purpose. Eliza heard it before she saw it, the creak of wood, the low voices of white men trying not to wake the house, the nervous shifting of feet that always accompanied transactions meant to be quick and unquestioned. This time, the cargo was children. They were brought onto the plantation in silence, eyes wide, clutching at one another with the instinctive desperation of the very young. Some were too small to understand what was happening. Others already knew enough to be afraid. Eliza saw the signs immediately, the way they were kept separate from the others, the way overseers watched them more closely, the way numbers were spoken instead of names. These children were not meant to stay. They were meant to be sold. Something inside Eliza hardened. This was not the sudden, burning anger she had felt when her own son was taken. This was colder. Sharper. Purposeful. She understood now that grief alone could destroy her, but direction could turn pain into something else. She did not rush. She did not panic. She reached outward. The network did not announce itself. It never did. It existed in fragments, a woman who knew a path through the marsh, a man who could read the sky and predict patrols, a free black carpenter in town who asked no questions but left doors unlocked at certain hours. Eliza had brushed against it before without fully realizing what it was. Now she stepped into it. Her first contact came through an older man named Isaiah, a field hand who had survived 3 plantations and carried scars that mapped his history better than words ever could. He listened as Eliza spoke, not of escape, not yet, but of timing. "When do they move people?" she asked quietly. Isaiah looked at her for a long moment before answering. "When the fields need clearing," he said. "And when the roads are busy enough to hide the noise." That was enough. From that point on, Eliza became a signal rather than a voice. She marked days by the master's mood. She counted patrols by the number of men missing at dinner. She measured danger by how often dogs were fed. Information flowed through her and outward again, changing shape as it went. What began as observation became instruction, subtle, incomplete, but powerful. Not tonight. Wait for the rain. Take the long way. No one ever heard the full plan. No one needed to. And then, people began to disappear. At first, it was one man. A field worker assigned to a neighboring plantation. His tools were found by the road. His body was not. The overseers assumed recklessness. A bad decision. A foolish attempt. Then it was a woman. Then a family. Always just enough time between disappearances to avoid pattern. Always different routes. Always different helpers. The masters searched for explanations and found none. They increased patrols. They threatened punishments. They accused one another of negligence. But the plantation continued to function. That was Eliza's genius. Nothing collapsed all at once. Nothing announced itself as rebellion. Work continued. Heads stayed bowed. Yes, sir. No, ma'am. The system remained standing, even as pieces quietly slipped away. Children vanished without footprints. Adults dissolved into forests and swamps. Entire families ceased to exist on ledgers that insisted they had never been there at all. Whispers began to spread beyond Hartcroft. In nearby counties, white men spoke uneasily of something they could not name. A presence. A pattern. A rumor that refused to take a solid shape. They called it the shadow. Some said it was a man. Others said it was many. A few insisted it was a myth meant to scare careless overseers. No one suspected Eliza. She was too quiet. Too small. Too obedient. She continued sweeping floors and washing clothes, her hands moving through the house as they always had. But now, each movement had weight. Each day was chosen rather than endured. At night, she listened to the sounds of the plantation and could tell, from the absence alone, who was gone. She felt no triumph. Only resolve. The shadow did not destroy the order of things. It unraveled it, slowly, deliberately, without ever showing its face. And at the center of it all stood a woman no one noticed, guiding disappearances with nothing but patience, memory, and the quiet understanding that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply moves. And by the time those in charge realize something is wrong, the most important pieces are already gone. Fear changes sides. Fear had always belonged to the enslaved. It lived in their bodies, in flinching shoulders, lowered eyes, and the instinct to listen for footsteps even in sleep. It was woven into every command, every punishment, every silence that followed violence. But something had begun to change. The planters responded to the disappearances the only way they knew how, with force. Patrols doubled. Dogs were brought in. Passes were demanded more frequently. Overseers were ordered to watch not just the fields, but one another. Whips cracked more often, not because discipline was required, but because authority felt uncertain. And uncertainty made men cruel. Yet the cruelty did not restore control. It accelerated collapse. Work slowed, not dramatically, not enough to justify punishment, just enough to be costly. Tools broke at inconvenient moments. Wagons lost wheels. Gates were left unlatched. Livestock wandered into swamps and were never recovered. Each incident could be explained. Together, they were devastating. Harvests missed their marks. Buyers hesitated. Creditors demanded explanations. The plantation economy, built on precision and predictability, began to falter. And worse than loss of profit was loss of trust. Planters accused overseers of incompetence. Overseers accused workers of sabotage. Neighbors began to suspect one another of hiding fugitives or leaking information. Men who once drank together now watched each other closely across dinner tables. The white community, long united by dominance, began to fracture. They spoke of conspiracies. Of hidden hands. Of enemies they could not see. They were right. The betrayal came quietly. A young enslaved man, barely more than a boy, was caught trying to run. He was beaten, isolated, threatened not just with pain, but with what would happen to his family if he stayed silent. Fear, the old kind, returned to him with full force. And he spoke. He did not know much. Only fragments. A name. A pattern. A woman who always seemed to know when trouble was coming. Eliza Brooks. When they came for her, it was in daylight. They expected resistance. Screaming. Collapse. The satisfaction of watching a myth unravel into flesh and terror. Instead, they found calm. Eliza stood where she always stood, near the back of the house, hands folded, eyes lowered. She did not deny what she had done. She did not confess either. She simply existed, unchanged, as if the weight of their attention meant nothing. Punishment was assumed. It always was. But this time, something unprecedented happened. A voice interrupted the proceedings. It belonged to Reverend Hale, the local pastor, a man who had baptized children, buried bodies, and watched the system he preached obedience to rot from the inside. He stepped forward, trembling but resolute, and questioned the charges. Not their legality, their morality. Then came Samuel Whitaker, a small farmer whose land bordered the swamps and whose missing tools had returned one night without explanation. He spoke not of sympathy, but of fact, that what was happening was destroying the region, not saving it. And finally, the widow Margaret Langford, a woman who had once owned people herself and had buried a husband who believed slavery was God's design. She stood in silence for a long moment before speaking words that stunned everyone present. "This system has made cowards of us," she said. "We hide behind violence because we are afraid of losing control." The crowd shifted. The moment cracked open. For the first time, white voices did not speak in unison. Some demanded blood. Others demanded order. A few, quietly, demanded change. Eliza watched it happen with the clarity of someone who had already seen the truth. The fear had moved. It was no longer lodged solely in the bodies of the enslaved. It had risen upward, into the minds of those who ruled. They feared exposure, ruin, reprisal. A future they could no longer command. No execution followed. No public punishment. Not because Eliza had been forgiven, but because punishing her now carried risk. She had become a symbol. And symbols, once recognized, are dangerous to destroy. That night, the plantation felt different. The silence was no longer submissive. It was watchful. Heavy. Charged with possibility. Eliza returned to her quarters unchanged in appearance, but everything around her had shifted. The masters knew they were no longer unseen. And for the first time, they understood what the enslaved had always known. Fear, once it changes sides, cannot be forced back into place. Eliza survived. Not through mercy, and not through forgiveness, but because the world around her had changed just enough to make her death inconvenient. The system that had once crushed dissent without hesitation now hesitated itself. It paused, recalculated, and in doing so revealed its weakness. Eliza returned to her work, though nothing was truly the same. The plantation still stood. Orders were still given. But obedience no longer carried the same weight. Something invisible had shifted, and everyone felt it. The silence was different now. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of awareness. Months passed. Information continued to move, more carefully, more widely. Eliza no longer stood at the center of every decision. She didn't need to. Others had learned to see as she did. To listen. To wait. to act without announcement. That was how movements survived. The moment Eliza learned her son was alive came without ceremony. A name spoken too carefully. A location mentioned in passing. A pause that meant more than words ever could. Eli was working on a small farm 2 counties away. Older now. Thinner. Still alive. The reunion was not dramatic. There were no crowds. No speeches. Just a woman standing at the edge of a field, watching a young man turn toward her with recognition that arrived slowly, like dawn. When he said her name, she closed her eyes, not in relief, but in completion. She had kept her promise. When the opportunity came to flee north, Eliza refused it. Others took it. Many needed to. She helped them prepare, shared what she knew, watched them disappear into safer futures. But she stayed. Not because she was unafraid, but because she understood something now that fear could not erase. Her fight had never been only for herself. It had been instructional. Across the region, small changes appeared. Work slowed in coordinated ways. Information passed invisibly through kitchens and fields. Disappearances continued, quieter now, smarter. Resistance no longer announced itself as defiance. It disguised itself as routine. The methods spread because they were simple. Anyone could listen. Anyone could remember. Anyone could wait. Years later, Hartcroft Plantation failed. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. It shrank. Lost workers. Lost money. Lost relevance. The land was sold, divided, abandoned. Buildings rotted. Fields flooded. Nature reclaimed what exploitation could not maintain. Eventually, there was nothing left to mark the place. No monument. No grave. No apology. But the story remained. It lived in whispered lessons passed from parent to child. In warnings disguised as advice. In the quiet confidence of people who understood that power does not always reside where it claims to. Eliza Brooks was never written into ledgers. Her name did not appear in official histories. But her impact traveled farther than paper ever could. She had proven something dangerous. That revolution does not always arrive with fire and shouting. That systems built on arrogance can be undone by patience. That silence, when chosen rather than enforced, can become a weapon. Long after her voice was gone, the echoes of her choices remained. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between obedience and resistance, others learned to listen. Just as she had.